Okay, guys. So this is Miss Doherty. I'm going to attempt to record my first set of notes for you. We're just going to do the first section of these human population growth notes, and then I'll make a second set of, second recording for the second set of notes on age-sex pyramids, and then probably a third one for the demographic transition. This is going to help us to get through this topic more quickly and that we will be able to do more labs and more interactive stuff during class. And if this works well, then we'll plan to do this for even more units in the future. So, and I have my pen, so I'll be able to highlight things and write some stuff as we go along. And just so you know, this is same as the class. I'm not going to be able to go back and edit this without having to redo the entire thing. So if I mispronounce something or if I say something incorrectly, again, you'll just have to kind of deal with it. We can talk about it in class the next day. But it's basically, I'm recording this live. So let us start off with, I've jotted down our top 3 countries with the highest population, with the highest populations in the world. So number 1, we have China with, and I'll see if I can write this, we have China with 1.35 billion. And you don't necessarily need to know these numbers, but it's good to know our most highly populated countries. And then second place, we have India with approximately 1.21 billion. And it said that these two countries together make up about 38% of all people worldwide. And then in a distant third is us, the U.S., with 314 million. 314. Ooh, this is bad. 314 million. Okay, I'm not going to try to draw too much because this is kind of difficult on my keyboard. Okay, so those are your top 3 most highly populated countries in the world. So let's go ahead and get into some of this population growth stuff. We have a lot of pictures and a lot of graphics to look at. This first one, we're not going to be talking about what population growth rate is until we get towards the end of the notes today. But it's still kind of good to look at where in the planet we have highest population growth rates, because we're going to talk about that a lot this unit. So if we look at our key down here, we see the countries that are this off-white color have really, really, really high population growth rates, and we say most of them are over here in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And then in the orange, you have, this is still very, very high growth, not the highest, but still, again, we have a lot of Africa, continues to have really high population growth rates over here in the Middle East, South America, Central America. And then when we get down here to your green and your blue colors, we see more of a stabilized growth rate. So a lot of the Western world has this green blue, slower population growth rate, and then really low population growth rate. And we'll learn that actually some of the countries in this category actually have what we call negative growth. We have a lot of Europe has very low growth rates and even negative growth, and then we even have a lot of Asia over here, and then Australia. So that's kind of a snapshot of what we're looking at worldwide. Okay. All right, there we go. So on my PowerPoint, I had a link to this human population clock, and I showed it to you guys at the beginning there, but it's actually really cool to look at. So if you get a chance, you can Google it. And if you remember, it shows you, if you click on it, it'll tell you, okay, here's what the human population is right now worldwide, and here's what the human population is for the U.S. right now. And then if you refresh the page a couple seconds after that, it'll actually, shoot up big time for the world. And I think it was like 3 or 4 people in the U.S. And what that comes down to is this next line. We're still experiencing a lot of people being added to the planet every second. So they say every second we add about 6 people. Oops, there goes the bell. We're adding about 6 people per second in terms of birth rate, and then taking away about 3 people per second in terms of the death rate. So overall, we're still continuing to grow. Now, we're going to be talking about, again, we'll talk about growth rates later, and we'll talk about different periods of time where we saw really high growth rates. But they say we've actually already peaked out at growth rates. They said, I think we peaked out in the 80s, but we also had really high growth rates back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. We'll bring up the baby boom later on. So growth rates have actually seen to have been decreasing, slowing down, but since we have so many people, we have 7 billion people on the planet now. We have so many people, and they're continuing to have more people make babies. It's estimated that the population is going to double again within 100 years. Now, there are all sorts of different predictions about what's going to happen with human population growth rate. If we are going to start to slowly level off, if we are going to continue to grow exponentially, if we're going to experience a crash and burn. And again, we'll look at some pictures of that, and we'll talk about some ideas with that. But the way it is now, even with the slowed down population growth rate, it's still looking to double. So last year was a big year because we actually hit 7 billion people last year. In the over 7 billion people that are alive today, half of them live in poverty. So that's going to be a big aspect of this unit as well. Okay, let me move this out of the way. So we've been talking about the term carrying capacity with population growth. And, a big question is, what is a carrying capacity for humans? Will we ever reach this? Why are we still continuing to go on this J-shaped exponential curve? Well, obviously we're different than a lot of other wildlife that lives out there, where they're kind of limited by whatever resources they have. Humans, we've been smart. We've been able to kind of get our way around what would have been our carrying capacity, perhaps, based on things like human agriculture. So it says usually with wildlife, we usually base their carrying capacity on, how much food they have available, how much space they have available. But with modern agricultural practices, we have been able to come up with all sorts of crazy ways to produce our own food in excess, and then we can ship out food to other countries that need food, or we can import food from other countries. So we've really been able to sidestep our carrying capacity. So it's very difficult to tell if and when we would reach a carrying capacity. Okay, we have a couple of different graphics to look at in terms of human population growth throughout time, and this one goes way, way, way back. I'll see if I can kind of move this. I'll move it in a little bit. But anyways, this is counting in billions of people, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And basically the gist of it, we can see thousands of years back. Human population growth has stayed very, very low, and in fact, it stayed well below 1 billion people. We have some different stone ages. Here we have like a way distant agricultural revolution and domestication of animals. We'll look at another picture that talks about that. And then we had societies form eventually. Now this shows a huge dip that we experienced due to the plague back in medieval times. And then we see here with the Industrial Revolution, and along with some other revolutions and some other advancements, that really led the way for human population growth to skyrocket. And we were able to exceed 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, 4 billion, 5 billion, 6 billion. And then, of course, we've already reached 7 billion as of last year. This is a pretty neat graphic here. This is going to show you, and let me see if I can get this out of the way. This is going to show you the amount of time that it's taken. Sorry. Okay, I guess that's going to stay there. The amount of time that it's taken to get from each of our different billions, and we can see is that those gaps have gotten smaller throughout time. So we can see we didn't reach our first billion until 1800, and then we can see if you go back 2,000 years ago, it says the population was only 150 million. So we reached the first billion in 1800, we reached the second billion in 1930, so there we've got a nice gap of about 130 years between 1 and 2 billion. Then let's look at our gap between 2 and 3 billion. Between 2 and 3 billion, we went from 1930 to 1960, so our gap lowers to only 30 years. from 3 billion to 4 billion, 1960 1975, so that's 15 years, so we're cutting in half there. From 4 to 5 billion, 75 to 87 would be what? 12 years. Yeah, there we go. So again, we're reducing it. And then from 87 to 99, again, that is 12 years. So these actually stay the same. And I was looking at another source, and they said, I guess from, let's see, 6 billion to 7 billion, they said it was about 13 years. So it looks like that gap actually increased a little bit. And then I looked at this other guy's predictions, and he said that he believes to get from 7 to 8 billion it's going to be 15 years, and then from 8 to 9 billion it might be 19 years. So they're actually, because of the growth rate decreasing, they're actually, I mean, we're still adding lots of people to the planet, but they're seeing the time that it's taking to add those extra billions might actually be increasing in the future, which is good because it's showing a little bit of slow down. Okay, and here's a graphic similar to what we already saw. So again, if you go way back thousands of years ago, 11,000 years ago, we have domestication of plants and animals back in 9,000 BC. Here you have societies based on agriculture, so they're settling down with their domesticated stuff. 5,000 BC, and then again, your industrial revolution, scientific revolutions really led the way. Oh, and there's your plague dip. But anyways, the Industrial Revolution really led the way for these new technologies, which allowed people to live a lot better, which really caused population growth to skyrocket. And then we have a timeline of the billions again over here. And then this one shows that we're projecting the population for 2050 to be over 9 billion. So we'll see. Okay, so we talked about technologies that have allowed us to sidestep our carrying capacity. So specifically, here's three main ones you should know about. We have the Green Revolution, medical advancements, and the Industrial Revolution. So the Green Revolution is like a modern agricultural movement back in the 1940s and 1960s. Basically, we figured out ways to better practice agriculture, and that way we're able to grow a lot more plants a lot more efficiently and keep up with the rapidly growing human population. So we were able to do this by creating pesticides and irrigation methods. Now, of course, we know that there are environmental consequences that come along with using these types of things, but they really helped us to grow crops a lot more quickly, a lot more efficiently, and in better quantities. We also were able to create synthetic, man-made nitrogen fertilizers. And then through genetic modification and through selective breeding techniques, we were able to create special crops that give really good yields, and they grow really, really well. So things like rice, wheat, maize, however you want to say it, grew really, really well, really, really quickly, and again, it allowed us to keep pace with the really quickly growing human population. Okay, medical advancements. Big one is the development of penicillin and antibiotics. Back in the day, people used to die from random little bacterial infections that today we would kind of laugh at, like syphilis, which we know is a STD. A lot of people would die from that because that goes on, it's a bacterial infection. It goes on to affect your nervous system. I believe, I'm trying to think of that famous mobster, I think Al Capone was his name, but I believe he died in prison of syphilis. So bacterial infections used to be untreatable and you'd die from them. Now we have antibiotics that they were hailed as a miracle drug. You can easily treat those bacterial infections and, move on with your life. Cancer treatments, we've gotten better with those. AIDS drugs, we'll talk about HIV and AIDS and how that still is affecting certain parts of the world, but we have come up with treatments that have helped a lot. And then vaccinating is a preventative measure. You get a shot, which creates an immunity. So in case you come in contact with the disease, you've already got a built-up immunity for it. So those have been very powerful as well. Also, we're going to be talking a lot about babies and fertility and having babies. So a really big issue worldwide was infant mortality, babies dying within the first year of their age. So having a better knowledge of OBGYN type things has really helped to decrease infant mortality rate, which gets us past that first year, which then gets a lot more people into childhood and adulthood. So that's been huge as well. Also, we've increased life expectancy due to these medical advancements. So these are all things that have really helped the population growth rate to kind of pick up the pace. Okay, I guess we don't have Industrial Revolution. I thought we were going to have Industrial Revolution, but I'm sure you guys have heard of that, and that with that came a lot of new technology, and that really, again, is something else to help the population growth to continue to increase. Okay, so with the increase in growth rate, here are some other things that have kind of come along with the territory. So we've had to expand our habitat. So more people means that we need to find more livable areas. And it says that we've actually done okay with having increased capacity in existing habitats. So we've talked a little bit about that earlier. We said, maybe building upwards, building high rises, skyscrapers, putting people into higher buildings instead of building outward, because when you're building outward, you're taking up more land, you're taking up more habitat, which is encroaching on wildlife space, which we just finished talking about last chapter. Having more crowded cities, having more people living an urban lifestyle within cities. These are all things that have kind of allowed our population growth rate to continue to grow. Substituting and importing resources. Again, animals can't really do this out in the wild, but humans can. If we need food in a country, if we've got a drought or we can't really farm very well, we can actually ship in resources to that country from another country. And sorry, my light in my room just went out. Let me turn the light back on. Okay, that's not working. There we go. Population has sidestepped limiting factors because of agricultural technology and medicine. Okay, we've already covered that. And great. What's going on here? Okay, moving on. Okay, so it says, even though we've been smart, we've been crafty, we've come up with all these ways to sidestep our carrying capacity, there are still things that are even beyond our control. If we have too many people on the planet, we may eventually run out of enough food and water. That's a big one. We're going to talk about freshwater availability later on this year. That's going to be huge. Invasion of parasites, pathogens, disease. So again, these are all things. We can be prepared for them, but we never really know exactly what we'll be facing. Overcrowding, climatic changes, and then pollution. Okay, this is a really cool graphic. We're going to be talking about human resource consumption throughout this chapter as well. We've talked a little bit about what a developed and a developing country is. We're going to be getting to that. Actually, well, I guess I can talk about it now and then we'll kind of get the definitions here in a little bit. But this is kind of interesting. A developed country would be like our country, where we're industrialized, we have a good economy. A developing country would be a country that does not have very good industry. They have high levels of poverty, and they do not have a good economy. And what we're looking at here is we're seeing a percentage of these different resource uses worldwide based on these categories, and then they gave us our own category just to kind of show us, set aside from developed and developing countries, where we're at. So if we first look at this population, these bars over here, we can see that actually most of the world's population is still in developing countries. Only a small percentage of us are developed. And if we look here, I guess we should kind of consider this 5 as part of this 21, the way that they have the numbers. Okay, hazardous waste, meaning in terms of the amount of hazardous waste that these different groups give off, we can see that only 10% of hazardous waste come from these developing countries, which makes up most people in the world. Our little 5% of the world population gives off 72% of the hazardous waste. And then we can see there's only a small amount there that's coming from other developed countries. Over here, as far as energy consumption goes, only 25% of worldwide energy consumption comes from developing countries, whereas just us little 5% US takes up about a quarter of it, and then we can see the rest of the developed world, uses a lot. And then over here, fossil fuel consumption, same general idea, kind of similar to this one. The developing world only uses 40%. Meanwhile, the developing, who only makes up the small percentage over here, uses the most. Here are species extinctions. So this is showing you kind of effects of continued human population growth. We've said that we're in one of the greatest extinction episodes right now, and they blame that mostly due to human population growth because we're encroaching on their habitat and we're using a lot of resources. Here we're looking at deforestation rates. We're also looking at habitat fragmentation. We've actually looked at a couple pictures similar to this where here we see all the virgin forests that existed in our country back in the 1600s. They're becoming more broken up and more fragmented in the 1800s. And ooh, this is sad. This is in 1989. Just barely any little virgin forest out here out west. And then again, this is a tropical deforestation rate through some pretty recent decades. So we see the deforestation rate continuing to climb in all of these countries, or all of these regions, I should say, probably mostly due to human population growth and increased resource usage. Okay, so this says if we do not take steps to control human population growth, it's likely that one or more of these growth limiting factors that we've just talked about will come in and forcibly reduce our numbers so that we'll eventually either reach a carrying capacity or we have some sort of population crash. And here we see a nice little overcrowded situation of people. Okay, so I think we've actually looked at this graphic at the beginning of the year as well, where, again, I'm not going to go back through all the old stuff, but this one is showing what could possibly happen. So we know right now we're on this J, we're exponentially growing, we're shooting straight up. Can we continue to be smart enough to come up with ways to sidestep that carrying capacity? Will we stabilize? Will we find a nice little S-shaped curve where something comes in and forcibly reduces our numbers, or I shouldn't say forcibly reduces our numbers, but it reduces our growth rate where we can finally slow down and level off. Maybe we've run out of space, or maybe we've run out of food and it will kind of slow down and level us off. Or could we have a population crash where we go over our would-be carrying capacity somewhere in here, we way overreach that, and then by the time we realize we don't have enough of something, that the population would crash. I've looked at a couple of people's different resources, and it seems that a lot of the experts think that within the next 3 or 4 decades, we will most likely kind of stabilize around 9 billion or 10 billion. That's the idea of some of the experts that I've looked at. But again, some people think that we can continue to grow, and some people think that we might actually see one of those boom and bust or a big time population crash. So again, we don't know what the future holds. We'll have to see. Okay, what are some impacts of continued growth? So obviously, if we have a lot more people than we have food, then we would have increased hunger and starvation. Desertification, we've talked about that a lot with our biome stuff. That's where ecosystems that should be forests and grasslands are now becoming deserts. Increased number of refugees. Refugees are people who used to live somewhere and now they're being forced to move due to some sort of an environmental refugee would be forced to move due to some sort of environmental issue, but in this chapter it could be really anything. They're forced to move due to social issues, cultural issues, just there's not enough room, there's not enough resources anymore. Increased urbanization, more people moving into the cities becoming more crowded, more dirty, dying seas and rivers, and then loss of biodiversity. Okay, so we just looked at that graph and we said we don't really know what's going to happen with the human carrying capacity. Here are some different views on what could happen with human population growth and kind of what should be our main focus. So we have a famous, I'm not even sure what category we want to put them into. He dealt with demographics and economics, actually. So anyways, his name was Thomas Malthus. I believe he was around in the 1800s. He's told us that human population growth is not always desirable. Obviously, if our human population growth grows too quickly and we outgrow resources, that we could face things like famine, disease, and war over valuable resources. And he's saying one of our main focuses in combating human population growth should be birth control measures. Then we have Karl Marx. He's kind of more of a socialist. He's kind of more on the people side, I guess. He says that the reason that population growth was getting out of control is because of poverty. Okay, and then in order for us to get over this, we need to try to eliminate poverty and keep people from being oppressed. And to do this, we need to increase social justice. So everybody has more of an even playing ground, and that way we can help to reduce poverty and get everybody jobs and boost the economy. So that's his idea. And then we have these people called technological optimists. These would be the people who think that we may never reach a carrying capacity. So again, just like it says humans can continue to raise our carrying capacity regardless of what population size we would ever reach. We could probably surpass 9-10 billion. We can keep going, because we are intelligent enough to continue to find ways to get more food and to get more space, grow up, make more foods, and so on. Okay, so we have a little bit of math in this chapter. We have some measurements. This one's called crude birth rate. It's number of births per 1,000. And the reason I'm underlining that is when I used to teach the IB version of this course, a lot of students would forget that it's out of 1,000, and they'd always do this number out of 100, but it's out of 1,000. Okay, so that's crude birth rate. Crude death rate is the number of deaths per 1,000. Okay. And then fertility rate, we'll talk about this more in some upcoming notes, but it's just basically how many kids a woman's going to have in her life. Okay, so if a woman has 2 kids in her life, her total fertility rate would be a 2. Okay, and again, there's actually like averages of that, and we'll get into that in a future unit. Okay, here are your equations for figuring out crude birth rate and crude death rate. Again, just number of births out of your total population times 1,000. Crude death rate, number of deaths out of the total population times 1,000. This graph is showing us crude birth rate and crude death rate from the 1980s through early 2000s, and it just showed us worldwide the crude birth rate decreased a whole lot. And again, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. We'll talk about how we can decrease birth rates, why we want to do that, and why this has happened. But the birth rate has decreased, which has been good. And we can see the death rate's pretty much stabilized. Okay, so let's talk about developed versus developing countries. I know we already mentioned this earlier, but they actually have like a more technical name to them. When we talk about a developed country, I guess the more technical term to call them is a MEDC, which stands for More Economically Developed Country. So characteristics of these countries is that they're usually industrialized nations. They have a high GDP, which is gross domestic product. This isn't letting me write. Which means that they have a good economy. They bring in a lot of money. They're relatively rich countries. People are unlikely to starve in these countries. They have a high resource use per capita, which when we see this term for now, we can kind of just think of that as meaning per person, meaning on average, each person in this country uses a lot of resources. Okay, and these countries usually have a low population growth rate. That is a characteristic of a more economically developed country. And again, we'll talk about later why these more developed countries have actually gotten to the point where their population growth rates have decreased. It has a lot to do with education and opportunities and that sort of thing. So then the opposite of that is an LEDC, which stands for less economically developed country. These countries are less industrialized, and it says some have actually no industry at all. Now, a lot of them actually have a lot of good raw materials that they're able to dig up, but a lot of times they make money by shipping these out to other countries. So a lot of times they don't even hold on to their valuable resources that they have. They get exported that way. They're able to make some money that way. They have a lower gross domestic product, and they usually have pretty high poverty rates. And they just generally have a low standard of living. And they have high population growth rates, usually because they have really high birth rates. Their death rates have started to get a little bit better. We've started to bring those down a little bit because of advanced medical care reaching them. But they still have high birth rate. So that's what we're working on, is helping these less economically developed countries lower their birth rate so that their population growth isn't so bad. Okay, here you see the yellow is crude birth rate, the blue is crude death rate. This is for these developed nations, the MEDCs. We can see that we've reduced birth rates since the 1950s, and they've continued to reduce. The death rates have stayed about stable. Now, with these developing countries, again, we've reduced them. We've reduced birth rates, we've reduced death rates, but one of the things, and we'll talk about this with the demographic transition, is we still have a huge gap between the yellow and the blue. We still have a huge gap between the birth rates and the death rates, which is going to lead to still very high population growth rate. We want to close that gap like we have over here. We have a very closed gap between birth and death rates, which means that the population growth is very, very slow. It's actually almost approaching zero. When you have a huge difference between your birth rate and your death rate, you have a lot more people being born than dying. That's what causes your population to grow really quickly. Okay, now if you want to define that little percentage that we call the growth rate, or we can call it the natural increase rate, NIR, this is how you would find that out. You would take that crude birth rate that we already had to find by dividing by 1,000 earlier, minus the crude death rate, and then that goes over 10, and that's going to give you a little percentage. It's usually like a decimal, like 0.7 or 1.2 or 2.4. Okay, and then this slide got completely messed up. This picture is actually over top of some important information. So this is showing you the global human population growth per year is about 1.4%. In developing nations, the average is 1.7, but in a lot of countries where you have really high population growth, it's usually in the 2s and maybe even 3s, which is really high. Oh, and by the way, it says at a global growth rate of 1.4% per year, we add about 84 million people per year at this rate. And then what we're missing right here is the developed country population growth rate, and that's it's 1.0% instead of 1.7. So a little lower. Where do we find highest growth rates in the world? Sub-Saharan Africa is huge. We'll talk a lot about that this chapter, and then also in the Middle East. And again, we'll get to the specifics, but just to kind of let you know right now, some of the reasons are social issues, political issues, education issues, birth control issues, family issues. Those are all reasons that the birth rates are staying high. Okay, and this is just showing population growth of different countries over the past centuries. I'm going to we'll just move through that for now because I want to get to the doubling time. Okay, you have another math problem you need to know how to do for this, and this is the time that it would take for a population to actually double its current size. Okay, and this is also called the rule of 70 because you're just taking 70 and you're dividing it by that NIR, that natural increase rate, that growth rate we just talked about, and that's going to give you a number of years. So an example would be if you had a growth rate of 1.4, which we saw, 1.4 on the previous slide was our global population growth rate. You would do 70 divided by 1.4, and it's saying that the population would double in 50 years. That's what that means. Okay. Again, here's more on the rule of 70, but again, all you need to know is you take 70 over the population growth rate. That'll give you a number of years. Okay, and that is it for our notes for today. I will record a second and probably a third set of notes for these next note sets. So that's all you need to have done at this time. All right, thank you. See you in class.